on May 16th, 2020. So congratulations. We have a new baby priest with us. It's great. Having received formation at St. Francis de Sales Seminary and having taken classes at Sacred Heart Seminary and School of Theology. His academic background is in mathematics and theology, and today he will be presenting on conversion and J.H. Newman. Father Sanchez.
Thanks very much, Steve. I'll share here the PowerPoint that I have prepared. Okay. Can you guys all see that? Okay. So what I'd like to do today is to talk a little bit about Lonergan, Newman, and different levels of conversion through the lens, particularly of the development of doctrine. So start off with this quote here from The Future of Thomism from Lonergan. Lonergan suggests that Thomism must move, quote, from logic to method, from science as conceived in the posterior analytics to science as it is conceived today, from the metaphysics of the soul to the self-appropriation of the subject, from an apprehension of man in terms of human nature to an apprehension of man through human history, and from first principles to transcendental method. I'd like to suggest that in this presentation, I'm going to try to imitate what Lonergan does in The Way to Nicaea, which is to use kind of a historical study, historical consciousness, as a way of giving insight into the dynamics of the soul. So here's what we're going to do. So, physicists tell us that although we see and experience 4 dimensions, there might actually be 8, 9, 10, depending on your preferred theory to reconcile relativity and quantum mechanics. There could be any number of dimensions. So what if there was a way of beginning to experience some sort of transformation by which you could experience those other dimensions? I'd like to propose that that's a way we can think about religious conversion as an experience, a transformation, which allows us to then experience the new dimensions of reality on a spiritual level. So the question that we can ask is there some way we can describe this new horizon, this new dimensions of experience which religious conversion allows us to grasp? I'd like to propose that Newman offers us a way to describe these new dimensions. So this quote here from Lonergan, this is from The Future of Christianity. Religious conversion brings us into a new horizon. Being in love with God is the existential stance opening on the horizon in which Christian doctrines are intelligible, powerful, and meaningful. For the dimensions of this horizon, I suggest we look to Newman, especially to his essay on the development of Christian doctrine. And this is a more historically conscious, like I said, historically conscious way of approaching this, rather than going about it by like metaphysics, studying the essence of the soul, its powers, and so forth. I want to trace the subject of the church developing through time. So let's look at Newman's essay here, which he wrote in 1845, or published at least in 1845. And it was this remarkable display of authenticity. As Newman, who's an Anglican, wrote this book, this 300-page book on the essay of development of doctrine, to kind of answer his own question of why was there this perceived difference between the Catholic Church he saw in the 1800s and the Apostolic Church that he recognized in his studies. And his essay, this theory of the development of doctrine, which was kind of a bit of a shock to the people at that time. It answered this question, and he followed the answer in intellectual honesty into the Catholic Church. And basically, to summarize, and not really doing justice to Newman, but as much as I can, his argument in that essay, real and living ideas, and real is like objective, they have some weight to it, they correspond to or accurately describe the reality. And living is something that kind of captures the imagination, it inspires zeal, it excites. Real and living ideas necessarily develop, they have to answer new questions. And those new answers articulate aspects of the idea that up to then were just implicit. So these real and living ideas don't necessarily have to develop. And Christianity is this kind of real and living idea. And of course, you want to develop and answer new questions in fidelity to the idea itself, to answer questions authentically. And so you need some sort of mechanism for adjudicating authentic developments. And I didn't realize this, but Lonergan actually would agree with this if you look at the characteristics in insight. of the solution to the problem of evil, which Christians can recognize kind of as the church. He does recognize the need for a central authority to guide the ongoing development of this solution. Those 31 characteristics, you guys know. So Newman says that, yeah, sure, the central authority is the only practical test of authentic development, but one can give certain general characteristics of authentic development. The 7 notes, which we can think of as criteria, which point out to you developments in their authenticity. And there's 7 of them. We don't have time to go into all of them, obviously, but the second one here, which I think is pretty interesting, is continuity of principles. And you read it and you can understand it very kind of simply, like, oh, just, you have the same feeling or something. But you can also kind of try to say, what does it really mean? Something that Newman said in describing this, in describing principles, is principles are to doctrines what the axioms of a mathematical system are to its definitions. And most of the explanations of this note that I've read don't really go into that and talk about that characterization of principles that Newman offers. But that kind of triggered my interest and my curiosity. So maybe I want to study these principles in more detail. And the essay gives us a few examples. Here's just a couple.
Father Edward, real quick, would you be able to just maybe make it a little bit bigger by making the left-hand thing a little bit smaller? Does that make sense?
Yeah. Let me see if I can do this. Okay. Yeah,
that's great. If that works for you.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, we can do that. I'll just be looking over here.
Thanks.
Yeah, so here's a few examples. Dogma, which is Newman describes it as supernatural truths being commuted to human language, imperfect because human, but nevertheless absolute and definitive. I would say the principle of dogma is basically, we can describe it in this way, that accuracy in the discovery of religious truth is a moral responsibility for each individual. That's how I would describe the principle of dogma, and that it's possible to accurately affirm religious truth. And then the principle of sacramentality, which is that divine gifts are conveyed in material and visible media. And then the principle of asceticism. And so these are kind of a few examples of principles, first principles, that Newman says belong objectively to the Christian idea. And we can recognize them in Christian liturgy and Christian teaching, and in the development of Christian dogma. These principles can obviously and have to be subjectively appropriated. So there's a subjective version of principles, which are the axioms that I take as structuring the horizon within which I look at the world. Okay, and so you can see kind of there where we're going to go with the Lonergan connection in a few minutes. So I would just suggest, and I argue more for this paper that I wrote, but the continuity of principles is basically the stipulation that one has taken the objective principles of the Christian idea as one's own subjective principles, as axioms for one's own thinking. I want to give a couple of quick examples of what I mean as I talk about these objective principles. So one example is the primacy of grace. And you can see these different moments of articulation, moments of teaching of this principle throughout the development of Christian doctrine. We look at Romans 8 and 9. You look at the condemnation of Pelagianism in 418, Council of Carthage, condemnation of what's called semi-Pelagianism in 529, Council of Orange. And so I think if you look at these moments of teaching, these articulations of doctrine as kind of dots, they kind of articulate this overall axis, which then I would say we can think about that as one of the dimensions of the new horizon engendered by religious conversion. That's the image, at the risk of picture thinking, I know, at the risk of picture thinking, that's the image that I'm kind of playing with here. Another example is sacramentality, or the incarnational principle. So if you look at the First Council of Nicaea, Lonergan's preoccupation in the way to Nicaea, where we say there's divine life present in the human stuff of Jesus. And it was by reason of analogy to that Nicaea II, the Second Council of Nicaea in the 700s, affirmed the value of icons, saying that spiritual meaning can be present in the material images that we make of saints, of Mary, of Jesus. And finally, you can see another dot along that axis in the Council of Trent, affirming the supernatural presence of Christ in the Eucharist. And of course, like I said, these are objective. They're kind of like, if you think about like Wittgenstein, talking about the objectivity of words, meaning within a given language game, these kind of have an objectivity within the world of the Christian church progressing through time. But we still have to learn the words, we still have to learn the principles, and subjectively appropriate them. And that happens through conversion. So if we're talking about conversion, we want to talk about Bernard Lonergan. And Lonergan, not surprisingly, assigns a key role for conversion in the development of doctrine. And he doesn't have a huge theory about development of doctrine, but he does talk about, in the way to Nicaea, I think in Method and Theology, he talks about the development, transpositions of meaning, which is basically how he conceives of development of doctrine. So we think about development from the mode of common sense with images, to technical mode, precise propositions, to systematic, which I'd include here, but you can see it there as part of the technical, and then to the interior. So as an example, development of doctrine could mean transposing a truth about Mary from the realm of images and metaphors, common sense, for example, woman clothed with the sun, Revelation 12, to then the realm of propositions, like we saw in the 20th century with the Assumption. So this process of transposition of meaning from one level of meaning to the next has four aspects, which are in the way to Nicaea, and the objective, the actual articulation in the new mode, the subjective, becoming competent in the new mode, evaluative, affirming the value of affirming this religious meaning in the new mode, and the hermeneutical, which is kind of balancing all the data of revelation, having an accurate framework. So we can see an example pretty related to what Lonergan talked about in the way to Nicaea. When Jesus says, I and the Father are one, that's obviously an image, and it requires to articulate that precisely with the homoousios, a subjective development, which Lonergan in the way to Nicaea ascribes to Athanasius, where he was able to say that the true is, or the real is the truly affirmable, right? That intellectual moment of conversion, and that it was Athanasius' faith that kind of enabled him to do that, to hold true to the data of revelation long enough to articulate it in this newly intellectually converted way, while the opponents, what Lonergan calls the Judeo-Christians, the Sabellians, the kind of heretics, if we will, of that time, they weren't able to articulate. They were tied too much to the image-based thinking. Even Origen, Lonergan describes it that way. So that requires some intellectual conversion, which is driven by Athanasius' faith. So that's a little bit about development of doctrine there. And we can see it even in the functional specialties. When we look at if an increment is going to take place on a level of doctrines, it's going to be grounded in the reality of foundations, right? And foundations is simply the objectification, kind of thematization of conversion. So let's talk a little bit more specifically then about conversion. These are some thoughts from Jeremy Wilkins in Before Truth. These first two. Conversion takes place in concrete events, and it's relational. It makes more authentic conversation possible, which I think is just beautiful, amazing insight there. And then here the third point is from Michael Rende, that conversion is a shift in priority from content to act, to understand the meaning within my own humanity, okay, and not just to make statements about it, but to understand and grasp the reality that kind of comes before the words. And this conversion is probably familiar to many of you, has several levels: the religious conversion, moral conversion, and intellectual conversion. So I want to kind of go to this question here: is there a difference between intellectual conversion that occurs on its own and intellectual conversion that results from religious conversion? Because just as in the way to Nicaea, Lonergan illustrated historically this religious conversion triggering an intellectual conversion, so he considers that happens in individual subjects as well. And I want to ask the question, is there a difference between intellectual conversion that arises in that way versus intellectual conversion that arises kind of on its own, like Stephen Hawking, right? Albert Einstein, these guys who are brilliant. I mean, they're not thinking about things with pictures, right? They see the real as the truly affirmable. You can probably say that there's a lot of intellectual conversion there, but it may not have arisen in the same way as it did for Athanasius. And is there a difference there? And I'd say that if we approach this question with those tools of Newman, with these first principles that he identified through study of the development of doctrine, that we have tools to answer this question in the affirmative and to specify something of what the difference is. So just a little bit quickly about intellectual conversion, and then a little bit about moral conversion, deciding for freedom. I'm guessing these are probably mostly familiar to many of you. Choice for genuine value rather than just satisfaction. Commitment to freedom, like to doing whatever it takes to be the most free. That's how you can think of moral conversion. And then finally, religious conversion, just falling in love with God. That what Patrick Burns talked about yesterday with this, becoming aware of the immediacy of the love of God within me, and then mediating that back to Him in prayer, and then as I see in learning. So that's that cascade of conversion. I kind of like to sum it up here. Religious conversion gives us values which don't fit the small containers of satisfaction, and which offers a further drive for Christians to pursue freedom wholeheartedly, not just for my own sake, but because I want to be worthy of the divine beloved. And that brings about this moral conversion, or gives an exigence for this moral conversion, which then drives me to grow in freedom, detaches me from the need for self-gratification, and causes me to want to understand myself more perfectly. What are the goods that are going to promote my freedom? Which causes me to understand myself then as a knower, and brings about that intellectual conversion. So let's kind of bring it all back here together. Recall that quote, being in love with God is the existential stance opening on the horizon in which Christian doctrines are intelligible, powerful, and meaningful. I would say that Newman's principles can describe this intellectual horizon. They describe what I wanted to use in this image as the axes or the dimensions of the horizon, which results from religious conversion. And to the extent that intellectual horizon is the result of authentic religious conversion, that horizon should be shaped by intuitions and first principles corresponding to the objective principles that Newman describes. I'd like to give just a few examples of why, first of all, why this is the right track, and then of how we could kind of understand it in the concrete subject. So I think that not only is this kind of consonant with Lonergan's historically conscious method, his approach, but I think that he actually started to do this in a couple of his works. So in The Future of Christianity, he cites this study by Friedrich Heiler, which identifies the 7 constants among the major world religions. Among people who have been religiously converted, they identified these 7 constants. And Lonergan says, yeah, look, this is exactly what one would expect to result from God's gift of his love. One of these is self-denial, which is exactly what, or one of those principles which Newman himself described. You can also look in method when Lonergan describes religious conversion giving rise to the new value of faith, another one of Newman's principles. So I think Lonergan started out down this road himself, and gives us good reason to think that this is something that's consistent with his thought. Now, you wouldn't expect to go from Lonergan's thought then to a principle of dogma necessarily, but I think with Newman, his understanding of dogma can be made consonant with Lonergan. So accurate discovery of religious truth is a moral responsibility of each individual. That's how I described Newman's dogmatic principle. And I think we can say this because the person who has experienced religious conversion now has as his highest value the love of God, the immediate presence of God who loves him there within him. And dogma imposes on the individual the mandate to learn about God accurately. And we mediate that love of God, the immediate love of God in our hearts, I say through prayer, but also through learning about God, learning about him. And that's kind of following this principle of dogma. And it gives us a great desire to be right about these truths about God, because we want to be right about the one that we love. Sacramentality kind of follows from the world mediated by meaning. So the world mediated by meaning means that the stuff that I see, what's most real about it is the meaning that is given to it by me, by my society, by God. And sacramentality simply means that the stuff that we see, what's most real about it is the meaning that God is giving to me through it. And just regular things, God used those as sacraments to reach us. And it's kind of a natural move from there to the privileging of certain physical things like water, bread and wine, oil, to become these privileged locations of God's meaning being transmitted. And that is, simply put, the principle that Newman points out of sacramentality, which you saw in Nicaea, Nicaea II, Trent, so forth. And finally, Newman likes this principle of the mystical interpretation of Scripture, which is basically the honoring of Scripture and the recognition that its words mean more than I could possibly articulate in a finite number of propositions. So he's very important to that. A final note that I want to say is that neither Newman nor Lonergan would say that these principles belong only to a Catholic or a Christian, even necessarily to someone who believes in God. Newman says that these can belong to people who are not Christian, and Lonergan would certainly agree with that. So that's kind of all I wanted to say about this. Religious conversion opens up a new horizon of reality, a horizon that can be described and that can be described using these principles, which Newman gives us in a very, I'd say, Lonerganian way, with these first principles that he's discovered. So that's all. Thanks very much, Steve.
Thank you so much, Father Edward Sanchez. Anyone have questions? We've got about 10 minutes or so, so feel free to speak up. You can either enter your questions into the chat or use the raise your hand feature. So I think I saw Andy Vink, your hand go up first. Go ahead.
Great, thanks, Steve, and thank you, Father Edward. It was great to have this interesting and stimulating talk. So one thing that came to mind while you were speaking about, especially linking it to Wilkins' discussion of the material conditions that lead to conversion. There are two figures that I think that came to mind in my own research, my own thinking, is that you have on the religious side of things, you have someone like St. Oscar Romero, right? He had his conversion, right? That's the language that tends to be used in the kind of the scholarship on Salvadoran theology of after Rutulio Grande was assassinated, right, in less than a month after he was installed as Archbishop of San Salvador. So you have that material condition recognition of the poor in El Salvador built to the point that you have a government that's willing to assassinate Catholic priests. On the other hand, you have someone like Karl Marx, who, where does the root of all of Marx's questions come from? And a comment that Dr. Byrne made to me many, many years ago at West Coast Methods is his concern for the coal miners, right? If you look at Marx's journalism, that led up to him writing Capital and his more academic works, it was a concern that people were being dehumanized in factories and in there's a genuine, I think, a concern for the human person and the alienation, to use Marx's language, that happens there. So I'm wondering, how would you say that they are both experiencing authentic conversion in that sort of pursuit of a principle of recognizing there's an injustice in the material conditions, or do you think that there's a significant enough difference outside of the religious connotations that kind of go in with Marx's theoretical work?
Well, that's I don't know. It's hard to say, Liam. I'll be honest about that. I think you can say that the different ways in which Oscar Romero and Karl Marx approached the same problem, the same recognition problem they both recognized. Different ways they approached it probably reflected the level of religious conversion that they had participated in. And so whereas the law of the cross is probably a value for Oscar Romero, and that only religious conversion, I doubt that you could say the same thing about Karl Marx. And so those are different approaches to the same problem, which come from different levels of appropriation of the Christian message. Yeah, I mean, it's hard to really say, not knowing Karl Marx's theory like super well, or Oscar Romero's philosophy super well myself. Did I speak to your problem, to your issue at all with that, like different levels of religious conversion?
So I think, so you did in a little bit. The one thing I would sort of kind of, think about too is there's an element of the relation of the Jewish context for Marx that I think is something that is worth kind of maybe thinking about a bit too, right? Because his in the theses on Feuerbach, right? There's a very critical attitude towards Feuerbach, who's going to reject praxis in general, right? That we should just have this reflection and an interiority, and not in Lonergan's sense, but in something far more complacent. That Marx is like, it's good that you've rejected this religious aspect of conversion, or of not conversion, sorry, of that comes along with praxis, but praxis in itself is still good. So I think there's a lot of there's something to be mined there about what Marx's relationship, especially to the exegetic narrative. So I would encourage kind of to think a little bit more about that, as well as when it comes to Romero, I think that there's definitely, I would argue that Romero is following through very much what Lonergan talks about. I'd recommend Michael Lee's Revolutionary Saint as an excellent study on how that goes about. Just some points for edge on your thinking more about this.
Sure. Yeah, thanks.
Thanks, Andy. Let's go to Monsignor Liddy. Did you have a question? Oh, I think you're still muted.
You're still muted.
Okay. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
That was great. That was terrific. And I really enjoyed it. And I just maybe ask you to talk a little bit more about Newman's principles vis-a-vis Lonergan's horizons. And Lonergan talks about the third stage of meaning, where I guess horizons get articulated in a theoretical way. But he basically seems to say so much about what Newman contributed to him and gave to him that it's almost like Newman was stretching toward the third stage of meaning, even though the way he put things were rhetorical, greatly in a sort of an unsystematic way, but leaning towards system. But anyway, it just anyway, anything you can say on that connection between Newman and Lonergan in terms of stages of meaning, that would be helpful for me.
Well, I think this continuity of principles as a criterion has to do with I guess the appropriation of the message deeply, and that would have to do with like having I guess with stages of meaning and Newman. I think he was trying to explain things in an interior way in a time when people wanted to hear about stuff in a systematic way. And so you see what Newman says and how different it is from the Thomistic world that he was trying to communicate to on the continent, and how he took the good from the English like empirical tradition and then kind of authentically appropriated that, but was able to go beyond it. I don't know about if he was ever able to make it to the systematic level of meaning but he did seem to like be articulating the real stuff that he had appropriated in the language that he had, which was the English empirical stuff. So I don't know if I can really answer your question super well there.
No, it's terrific. That's terrific. I mean, it seems to me he was stretching toward what Lonergan came up to, and he seems to me to give a lot of examples. One of the things that Lonergan said about Newman is that he gave great examples. So in a sense, Newman's alive today in a way such that he explains and maybe gives more examples of what Lonergan eventually put in a very systematic way.
Yeah.
So anyway, I think
that's a great way of putting it. That Newman has these examples and these images. He's like this man very in touch with himself. He's kind of this model of interior awareness.
Yep.
And then Lonergan is able to take that from reading a lot of Newman and then to articulate it in this kind of systematic with the structure of the, I think that's a great way of putting it. Yeah.
Yeah. Anyway.
Thanks.
Terrific. It's great talk. Thank you.
Great. Thank you. Yeah, I can't tell you how many times in my Lonergan margins I have written example ? Like, come on, Lonergan, just give me an example, concrete of what you're talking about. So one of my next stages is to read Newman. So maybe that will help with some of this. Great. Well, we have some more questions, but we're also it's time to move on. So I'm going to suggest we move on to our next speaker. And then potentially after this session, if Father Edward wants to hang out afterwards, this will just keep going so people can keep talking after.